Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone in the room and online to the Institute for Global Nutrition Seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. So we have Dr. Kendra Byrd, who's a global nutrition specialist. She's currently working as a consultant for the FAO's, the Food and Agriculture Organization, Fisheries and Aquaculture Division. In the past, she's worked for the University of Greenwich as a senior research fellow and also as a nutrition scientist at World Fish. So if you ever have questions about fish and nutrition, then you know where to go. So her research areas include aquatic food systems, healthy sustainable diets, micronutrient deficiencies, food security, and intersections between climate change and health. She received a PhD in nutritional biology from the program here in 2016. And conducted work in a range of countries, including Uganda, Kenya, Gambia, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Timor-Leste. So we're so excited to hear about your new work, and thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thank you. It's nice to be back in this room again. Okay, so the title of my talk is Aquatic Foods and Opportunity Crops, Strategies for Making Food Systems More Climate Resilient. And so just to start with a little bit of terminology, so you know the categories of food I'm talking about. Aquatic foods, it might seem sort of intuitive, but it's actually a very broad, diverse category. So it's any species of food harvested from water. So it can be inland. I mean, most people think of marine immediately, but it can also be inland, it can also be rivers, and it also includes plants. So species of algae and seaweed and aquatic vegetables. For example, my colleague recently reminded me about lotus stems that they consume in Timor-Leste. So that would be under aquatic foods. Other groups, you might hear the words blue foods to encompass this category, but I'll be using aquatic foods here. So just so you know, it's a diverse category. Opportunity crops, which was a relatively new term to me based on some work I've been doing this year, are crops that have been consumed, cultivated historically, but have been relatively overshadowed by the major crops. So rice, wheat, corn, or maize, and that have been underinvested. But they're called opportunity crops because they are projected to perform better under climate change conditions than the major crops. So I'll talk more about those when I talk about my findings, but this group selected 20 specific crops specifically, which I'll present. And so examples of these include grain amaranth, leaf amaranth, teff, which is native or indigenous to Ethiopia, fonio, which is indigenous to Nigeria, okra, etc. So just to frame the discussion, we know that food systems overall are failing us. I've heard this phrased. I've heard it phrased this way several times, and I think it's relatively apt because so many people are not consuming the nutrients they need. Recent research has really highlighted the number of nutrient inadequacies globally. And recently, we also know that there's high burdens of malnutrition on both ends of the spectrum. So recently, overweight and obesity among school children and adolescents has overtaken undernutrition, representing sort of an important shift in the food system, likely driven by in part by the proliferation of ultra-processed foods. In the meantime, food systems the production systems often negatively impact the planet. And so I don't know if any of you saw the recent release of the Lancet Planetary Health Diet 2.0 or the PhD. This paper really underscores this point of how the food systems are leading to climate change. And they're in this new report, which is very dense, they're talking about planetary boundary transgressions. So not just GHG emissions, but all these other aspects in which the food systems are impacting the environment negatively. So I pulled out one quote on land conversion, and their conclusion really is that we can't convert any more land to food producing regions if we want to pull back this impact on planetary boundaries. So lots of reform is needed there. And then in a vicious cycle, not only do the food systems impact climate change, but climate change is also impacting the food systems negatively and potentially reducing the nutrient availability in food systems. And so that last point is where I'll be focusing my talk today. And this review from 2017 really highlights all the ways in which greenhouse gas emissions specifically are predicted to alter nutrient content. So it's very dense, but I'll focus in on how interventions can address the altered nutrient content in crops and address the altered potential nutrient content in fish catches. So, of course, this is a big problem, how climate change are impacting our food systems, and more multinational institutions are taking notice, UNICEF being one of them. So they asked me to contribute to this report on climate change and the impact on maternal and child health. So we did an evidence review, and these are just a few points from the evidence review. This is about land-based foods, so crops, and how the temperature rise could lead to decreased productivity. Yields are predicted to increase. Specifically, nutrient intakes in certain plants are predicted to, or nutrient concentrations in certain plants are predicted to decrease. And global rice production could also decrease because of sea level rise. Similarly, climate change threatens fish catch as well. One prediction is that by 2050, fish catches, marine specifically, may decrease by up to 13%. Which would potentially leave an additional 845 million people at risk of nutrient inadequacies, specifically the ones like iron, zinc, vitamin A, B12, and omega-3s that we commonly think of in aquatic foods. And this is also concerning because aquatic foods are often the most affordable. Of course, this depends on the aquatic food, this depends on the region, but in a lot of settings, that's what we see. So what are some potential solutions to these existential intertwined crises? One that people talk about a lot is reduce food waste and loss. So the FAO estimates that about 50% of food is lost through food waste and loss. Some of you in the room might know it's hard to define, it's hard to measure, so that's just a rough estimate. Diversification, intensification of agriculture to increase crop yields is another solution, which I'll talk about. Improved agriculture and fisheries technologies, especially around productions and value chains. Of course, increasing the reach of large-scale food fortification and alternative animal source foods, which have potentially a lesser impact on the environment, which we heard about last week. But I'll talk specifically, the evidence I'll present speaks specifically to the three bolded potential solutions. And so, yeah, just to show that on this diagram, I'll focus specifically on the altered fish catch and nutrient content and the altered crop yield and reduced nutrient content that we might see in the future. So I'll share 4 recent findings. The first is comes from a study that I co-led in Timor-Leste, where we found that a simple device placed near shore attracted the fish, making them easier to catch. That's relatively well established, but we wanted to know, would that lead to increased fish purchase and consumption in the communities? And it did. And I'll talk about a recent paper I published with colleagues on dried fish and the nutrient composition of those fish and how many people do actually consume dried fish in Sub-Saharan Africa. The third is a relatively new project I'm working on with FAO on the edible byproducts of fish and aquatic foods. And then the fourth is findings from a report I did with Caroline Joyce, who recently graduated here. So many of you in the room probably know her, on opportunity crops and their nutrient density and policy potential. So first, the project in Timor-Leste involved a fish aggregating device, so a FAD. And this is a picture of one. And it, like I said, it's placed near shore. That's to distinguish from the ones that are not placed near shore. I guess there's some controversy about the big ones that are placed in the middle of the ocean that attract tuna. But this is a near shore one to assist small scale fishers with their catch. So it aggregates the fish and it allows more catch per unit effort is how they phrase it. So when the fishers go out to fish the FAD, they catch more fish per hour. And so this shields the small scale fishers from some of the potential impacts of climate change, where the fish populations are potentially migrating due to changes in the ocean. And so it's been relatively well established that FADs lead to increased fish catch, but we wanted to know, can they also improve diets? And so we conducted a cluster randomized controlled trial in Timor-Leste in Southeast Asia. And I put it on the map. You can't really tell where it is based on this picture. That it borders Indonesia, so it's a small country in Southeast Asia, surrounded on 3 sides by water. So you would think that their fish consumption would be relatively high, but it's actually pretty low on average. People on the coast consume a good amount of fish, but it just pales in comparison to other small island states where people just consume so much fish like Maldives consumes between 80 to 180 kilograms per capita per year. And there's a number of reasons why Timor-Leste does not consume a lot of fish, one of which the fisheries scientists tell me is that the shore just drops off. The ocean it's sort of like a shelf, it drops off very quickly. So it's very tough on the fishers to go out and fish near the shore and catch fish. Another reason that I was just discussing with one of the co-authors of the study, who's actually here with me today, Lydia, is that these inland mountains are so hard to reach. It's like the roads are steep and muddy, so it's really hard for the fish to make its way inland. So we wanted to know, does the FAD placement lead to the increased catch? Does it make its way inland to increase fish consumption and fish purchase by these households? Also, Timor-Leste is very poverty-stricken, it's one of the highest stunting rates in the world. So they really need more fish in their diet. So what is the impact of the FAD placement alone? We also wanted to look at an SBC arm alone, so single intervention arms and then combined. And the primary outcome was weekly household fish purchase and fish consumption, qualitative fish consumption among women and children after 1 year of exposure to the intervention. And just a bit about the social behavior change arm. It was delivered through Mercy Corps Timor-Leste, who they had a good rapport with people in the field, and just delivered some key messages through a village savings and loan group. These groups had already been established, and they did cooking demonstrations and edutainment events at the community level. So this our randomization led to 4 treatment arms: control, single arm, FAD only, SBC only, and then a combined FAD and SBC, or combined supply and demand intervention. And so we found that households were twice as likely to purchase fish in the previous week. So we didn't find an effect in either of the single arms, which was interesting. So it was only in the combined arm where we saw a slight increase in fish purchase consumption. So households purchased twice in a week rather than once in a week. And then this also translated to women's fish consumption. Their reported 24-hour yes/no fish consumption. So we saw a 4-fold increase in the the prevalence of women reporting fish consumption in the combined arm only again. We didn't really see anything in the children because we couldn't even model it because there was just so few children who consumed fish in our study, which is a whole other area of intervention and further study. But yeah, at least we saw a signal in the households and in the women that were inland, those hard to reach communities. So the fish were making their way inland. And so the implications are that, supply and demand interventions or food systems interventions really are more effective at changing behavior and changing diets. Nearshore FADs could be scaled to other small island developing states where fish consumption could be boosted a little bit. And this not only helps fishers adapt to climate change or become more resilient to climate change, it really does improve the diets of people in the hard to reach communities, at least in this setting. Okay, so from the marine fisheries of Timor-Leste to dried fish consumption in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is from, like I said, a recent study that we published in ENAS. The lead author is James Robinson from Lancaster University, who really drove this great analysis. He went and collected dried, powdered, fried fish from both marine and freshwater systems in several countries. And we analyzed at the Institute of Marine Research in Norway and other colleagues on the paper. And James also really led the charge in using household economic surveys to look at fish consumption at the household level to really get an idea about dried fish versus fresh fish consumption using these rich data sets of national economic surveys. It doesn't give us the same detail that we get from going in and doing 24-hour recalls, but it gives us a good idea. And so Lydia, who's here, helped with the nutritional analysis and presentation of this paper. And so we wanted to look in the literature and find out, okay, we know dried fish is important, and there's some qualitative studies around it, some of which we've done, but we wanted to look at, like, when people do quantitative, what's the amount that they're giving children when they give children dried fish to eat? And it's about 9 grams. So not a big amount. But that small amount does provide a lot of nutrients, given it's dried, it's concentrated. It's not dried all the way like you would do it for a sample in a lab, but it's very concentrated, shelf stable. There's a lot of good aspects. So this first fish is, it's called 1 man 1,000. So anyone is from Ghana or spent time in Ghana, I'm sure you've come across this fish. I have not, but but I hear people talk about it a lot, and I assume it's called 1 man 1,000 because it's everywhere. And so James purchased it dried from Akosombo in Ghana, and it does, you can see that even a small amount provides a good amount of selenium, 50% of the zinc requirement for children, 100% of the B12, some omega-3. This is iodine. This I is iodine. That might be kind of hard to see, but not a ton of iodine, but some. And then the second fish is from, it's called omena or daga or mukene. So that's found in Lake Victoria. So based on what country you're in is what you might call it. When I did Peace Corps in Uganda, I came across omena a lot. I never thought I would be thinking about it so much, but it's an important nutritious part of the diet. And so, yeah, again, you see about over 50% of the calcium requirement, 50% of selenium, again, almost 50% of zinc. And that one was purchased sun-dried. So they just dried out on mats. And then the third is a mix of Sardinella species. These two are freshwater, and then the third is a marine species. And James purchased it powdered or smoked from Ghana. And yeah, again, the 9 grams of the fish powder provides almost, maybe that's about 80% of a child's iron requirement. So yeah, so these were exciting. And this one is about 50% of a child's iodine requirement. So this study is filling an important gap, and we're very excited about it because if you look in the food composition tables, which probably many of us do, we see raw or we see boiled. You know, we don't necessarily see the forms of the food that they're consumed. I hesitate to use the word processed, but the lightly processed fish, we don't, or the other foods, we don't see the exact nutrient composition. So this is excellent. We're going to try and get it in the food composition databases so that people can pull the exact values, especially if you're doing a study, for example, in Ghana, you want to know the exact amount of iodine in the fish. You don't want to borrow a value for iodine from another species collected somewhere else in the world because it varies so much by geography. So exciting that this has been published. We've been working on it for a while. And these data are from the National Economic Surveys that James led, and we found that a third of the households consumed dried fish. So 144 million people in the countries that we looked at, which those are six countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it reached 54% more households than fresh fish. So it's really nice that it's shelf stable, it's portable, it's tradable, it's less likely to spoil. And not to say it has like an endless shelf life. And then if you just look at figure B, if you look at all 3 figures, you can see that the orange line is higher than the green line. More households are consuming dried fish. But this one is interesting because the further away you get from an inland fishery, the line is doesn't drop off. It drops off a little bit, but definitely not as much as fresh fish. So we're seeing a nice reach of the dried fish. We don't necessarily see the same in children. We see more of a drop off, but at least for households, they're making their way out from the inland fishery. Another good thing about dried fish is they're the small pelagic species. So they're small fish that are easy to dry. And these small pelagics have a relatively low, this should be slightly over. That's funny. I don't know if the formatting got messed up. But anyway, the point is the small pelagic fish have a pretty low GHG emission per nutrient associated with their production. It's down with roots and grains and wheat. It's not necessarily what we think of when we think of animal source foods, right? When we think of animal source foods, a lot of people often think of high GHG emissions. Of course, that's only the small pelagics. There are other aquatic foods like catfish and prawns that have a higher GHG emission per nutrient associated with their production. Again, this is marine, but it's probably similar for freshwater. And freshwater small pelagics are less likely to be overfished because they're small fish, their population turns over quickly. And so some scientists think that the yield can be increased substantially and within the sustainable yield of the fishery. So that's another good aspect of this dried fish small pelagic species. And so they really are climate resilient because it's an important source of concentrated nutrients. And the fisheries are impacted in different ways by climate change. So for example, if a major climate event happens, like a drought or flood that wipes out the terrestrial crops, people can still go and fish the fishery. They can fish the river, or the stream, or the lake. Of course, heavy rains impact the processing in ways that are much more impactful, because as people are trying to dry their fish and a big storm comes in, or even days of rain when they're trying to dry their fish, or even smoke their fish, that can lead to a lot of food waste and loss. So investments are needed to help people adapt these technologies to climate change and preserve these technologies in these value chains, which is very obvious when you see how much these dried fish contribute to diets. And so the third finding I'll talk about, and these are very preliminary, this is just something I'm sort of in the middle of working on, is on the edible byproducts of dried fish. And it's really interesting because it has a lot of potential, but it doesn't have a lot of demand. And so of course, many people in the world do consume a lot of parts of the fish. There's not a lot that goes to waste, but in certain places there is a lot of waste that can lead to environmental contamination, especially, for example, with tilapia aquaculture, which a lot of aquaculture is tilapia around the world. And so people sell the fish, a lot of people just consume the fillets, and the rest of the fish might go by the wayside or be sold for animal feed or whatever the case may be. And this is about 50% of the fish, so it's a lot of the weight of the catch. And sometimes small-scale fishers don't have the equipment, or they don't have the knowledge of how to process, because edible byproducts often need either a lot or a little processing. And so that's a barrier. But certain things like fish powder, fish mince, et cetera, could be made at home and incorporated into recipes. So some preliminary findings on the acceptability of tilapia byproducts, and it looks sort of like this. This is the tilapia spine with some meat, and they put it through a processor twice, and this processor would need to be more at the industrial level. But it looks basically like ground beef, so it could be easily made into like burgers or croquettes, and these were, in a preliminary report, ranked pretty highly by school children. Like they circled the very smiley faces a lot for this product, where that wasn't the case for all of them, but this is a good sort of example of how something like this could feed into school meal programs. So a lot of this work is to see how to improve school meal programs with edible byproducts. And so there's, again, a lot of potential there. And so this is just one table that I'm working on. It's in milligram per kilogram unit. I'm going to adjust the units and look at it against nutrient requirements, but it's just to show that if you compare the non-fillet basically versus the fillet, there's a lot more calcium, there's a lot more, about twice as much iron, and a lot more zinc. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential there with just maybe a little processing. Another thing that we're comparing is tuna frame powder. So with tuna, which is a relatively big fish, depending on the species, they take away the meat, and then the frame is left, or the skeleton. And so that can be processed into powder, which was done with this group in Ecuador. So now we're publishing the results of that nutrient analysis. And since we're looking at how these foods can contribute to school meal programs, we wanted to look at how just 10 grams of this tuna frame powder can contribute to, or compares to, 1 cup of cow's milk, because school meal programs are on tight budgets. They're more and more want to reduce their environmental footprint. And so this is sort of a nice graph, because it shows that, maybe you don't have the money for cow's milk every day. And you can replace some of those nutrients by adding a little bit of this powder to the meals. And yeah, reducing costs, reducing environmental footprint. Not to say that I would never say don't give milk, and also not to say that I would ever say don't eat the tilapia fillet. It's just how can we get more nutrients out of the catch and more nutrients into the food supply as climate change starts to reduce the nutrients. So this can help get all the nutrients out of the fish catch, makes the fishery more resilient to the decreases in fish catch, because as the small scale fishers learn they can sell these edible byproducts, that can increase their profits, maybe if their profits are decreasing from other climate related events. So yeah, in the future, there needs to be more investment in promoting this idea. Maybe not calling it byproducts. I don't know. Maybe need some better marketing. I know, to like to like Western ears, it sounds a little strange. I think Indonesia tried to develop something called fish milk, and I was like, I think that's not the way to go. But yeah, I think there's some marketing that can be done. There's some social behavior change around here, around this topic that can be done. And yeah, really help school meal programs reduce their costs, et cetera. And this also works to lower the environmental footprint per nutrient. So the GHG emissions per nutrient on that graph I showed you before, this can like lower, because it's per nutrient, this can lower that rate even more. And so lastly, I'll talk about a report I did earlier this year, again with Caroline Joyce, so I'm moving from aquatic foods to opportunity crops to plants, basically, which has been a nice departure for me. A little exciting to like look at other aspects of the food system. And so we built on this report but that was put out by the VAT consortium. So it's called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. And they put out a handful of reports on these 20 specific opportunity crops that they narrowed in on. They did a lot of research around all the different opportunity crops. And this had a focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. So they wanted to look at which had the most potential, both to be produced and consumed and to be climate resilient. So we built on their report, which included these 20 opportunity crops. So these are the 20. So a handful of indigenous grains. It's interesting that sorghum is on there because a lot of countries do already grow a lot of sorghum. But I guess the point is that they could grow more, or their sorghum rice production could be a little bit more in balance. Groundnut, sesame, Bambara, they call them Bambara groundnuts, but we changed that to Bambara beans in the report just because they were consumed more similarly to beans. Yeah, a number of legumes, a number of roots, tubers, African eggplant, amaranth, and okra. So they looked at 5 nutrients in the original reports, I think like protein, vitamin A, zinc, the ones you might think of. But we wanted to expand it and look at all the nutrients available, especially in light of the recent report by Passarelli 2024 showing just the scale of nutrient inadequate intake of a high number of them. So we wanted to look at all available nutrients, compare it against the recommended nutrient intake, the RNIs, the RDAs for women and children to hopefully raise awareness just on how nutritious these opportunity crops are. And then we also did a policy analysis where we looked at countries with the top 40 countries, the countries with the highest prevalence of, or not prevalence, problem of hunger, based on the global hunger index. So this global hunger index sorts countries based on prevalence of undernourishment, stunting, wasting, child mortality. So we took the top 40 countries with the highest burden of hunger and looked at the policies and a number of other things around those countries. And so this is one figure from our report, and this is for children 6 to 23 months. This is a 25-gram serving, cooked. I pulled the nutrient composition cooked for these crops. And what we did also is, to add to the original report, is we looked at the edible pieces, the edible portion of all of the crops. So the leaves, basically, that weren't originally included in the report. So there was a number of crops for which the leaves were edible, which I didn't really have a good idea for when I started. I didn't really know that you could consume cowpea leaves. I didn't have a good idea about amaranth leaves and how it's cultivated separately than grain. But yeah, the leaves really come out on top. Of course, we say it all the time as nutritionists, the dark leafy green vegetables, they're very nutrient rich, and these opportunity crops are no exception. Yeah, and we looked at all of the crops for all of the nutrients listed along the bottom. And if you go to the report, you can hover over these bars and see more specifically the nutrient contribution. I know it's kind of hard to see here, but just to give you an idea. And we also looked at per 25 calorie serving, so grams and calories. And then when we do 25 calories, then the leaves really come to the top. The groundnuts kind of fall, of course. 25 grams of groundnuts might be a lot for a little person, but yeah, very nutrient rich. Even the nutrient crop or the opportunity crops that are down lower toward the graph doesn't mean they're not an important part of the diet. It just means they don't have as much of the nutrients that we measured. They probably have a lot of other bioactive compounds or polyphenols that are important to the diet. And we tried to make that point in the report. We also did this for women of reproductive age. So that's also there. And then Caroline Joyce led this part, the policy analysis, where this is just, I don't think all 40 countries are listed here, but you can see them in the report. And we also did a dashboard, so you can look at the data a different way. But we looked at food-based dietary guidelines, nutrition policies, agriculture policies, biodiversity, and then that last one is climate change policies. So a number of countries do talk about these crops in their policies, whether or not they're largely grown, they're on the radar, especially as countries are trying to transform their food systems. Only 14% did so meaningfully relative to nutrition or climate goals. So it might have been more of like an ag productivity goal or a production diversity goal without linking to the things that we're trying to push for. But I think one thing to notice is the food-based dietary guideline column. A lot of countries don't even have one yet. So this is sort of a good opportunity to get these opportunity crops more highlighted and in the food-based dietary guidelines, which can then lead to consumer demand or can even inform like school meal programs. So that's an interesting opportunity. And then also we looked at the growing seasons of, or the harvest months of these crops. So Caroline really looked through a lot of data to really find where and when these crops are harvested. And so this is, again, just a snapshot from what's in the report, but you can really see that amaranth grain in Burundi is harvested 12 months out of the year, or some of the tubers can be harvested 12 months out of the year. So these can be scaled up in areas with high seasonal hunger, and especially when you consider the leaves of these crops, because the leaves can be harvested more often than the tuber in many cases, as I'm learning. But yeah, so lots of opportunity, lots of potential for opportunity crops to achieve both climate resilience wins and achieve nutritional wins. Of course, this is just a report on the nutritional contribution of these crops and a policy analysis, and we did some additional analyses, but there's going to be a lot of barriers, right? I mean, producers want to make money, they need resources, and so addressing the barriers around these production systems is going to be important, and providing resources so that there are extension agents that can teach people how to grow these crops is going to be a big step up. But I do think it's important if we're serious about transforming food systems. There could be more around stimulating demand, and there's a lot of like gender related stigma around these crops. The crops are sometimes thought of as like women's crops or like small household crops. So there needs to be work to sort of change the ideas around them. And then governments can include them in their policies in a more cohesive way. So in summary, we know that diets are poor and climate change is threatening to make this worse in a number of ways. But investing and innovating at various entry points in the food system can make the food supply more resilient. And I know a lot of people are talking about how to do this in a lot of different ways. So I just wanted to provide a few examples. And it's important to consider the most vulnerable populations who did the least contribution to climate change. So yeah, so I just wanted to give you an example of rural families living in Timor, populations dependent on the dried fish value chain, dried fish fisheries, school kids, and people living in high hunger countries need these investments and these innovations. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really great to hear about these different examples. And we have some time for questions and discussion, which is also great. Yeah, so we'll open it up.
Sure. Go ahead. Hi, thanks for a very clear presentation. I have a question regarding the dried and smoked fish. It's good to know that they were very micronutrient dense and meeting the needs of children. I was just curious to know whether concerns were raised regarding the introduction of carcinogens during the smoking process.
Yes, yeah, and that's like a big concern of mine, considering some projects I'm hoping to start. But yeah, we actually looked at mercury, lead, and cadmium. Yeah. Which I did have on a slide. No, that's been another presentation. Anyways, we did look at it, and the levels were relatively low. we looked at as a percent within a tolerable limit or something like that. And it was like below the percent of the tolerable weekly intake, I believe is how it's phrased. The other thing, which is the carcinogens, the PAHs, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons around smoking fish. We did not measure that, and I really wanted to, or slash still want to, because I know that like in West Africa, smoked fish is way more common than like sun-dried in East Africa. And so that's a big concern, not only, and I think I mentioned it briefly, not only the smoke inhalation to the processors, who are mostly women, but to the people who are consuming the smoked fish. So yeah, there are some data on from Ghana on the concentrations in smoked fish. And yeah, I believe the conclusion was there's a lot of benefit, but there is this sort of concern. And so more research is needed. And yeah, it's not like, yeah, it's not completely without risk. So yeah, it's an important point. And I think it needs a lot more work, or there needs to be like improved smoke dryers so that people don't have to inhale this smoke. That's, I guess, the subject for the clean cook stoves people.
Yeah, I enjoy your presentation a lot. In looking at the nutrient profile, the dried fish, you showed the three.
I'll go back to that since that's.
And I was surprised to see how low it was for omega-3s. Is there something about drying? Because I think of sardines as being very high in omega-3s.
Yeah, and actually there's another table in the PNAS paper that shows just how like accounting for water content, how much the nutrients are degraded. And omega-3, I think, is degraded by about 50% in drying. So you expect most of it to be retained. So
I'm assuming O3 is omega-3.
yes. Sorry, I should have put more of a legend, but yeah, good guess. Yeah, and I'm actually surprised by that too. But I think when you think about freshwater, potentially there's less.
But sardines are, I always promote like fresh.
Okay, yeah.
Sardines are great source.
So that's about 20%. I think that translates to about 20. It's hard to see.
Yeah.
And
okay, I was thinking it looked like it was close to zero.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was close to zero on an error release of this paper, and then I went back and looked. I was like, oh no, it was just anyways, it's about 20%. And yeah, it is. Some of it is lost with the drying, but a lot of it is retained. And I did a different analysis on freshwater fish from Zambia, and there was actually a lot of omega-3. There's a lot of DHA, EPA in those fish. So yeah, I think maybe because it's a smaller sample size, combined with the fact that sardines have slightly less omega-3s than some of the other bigger species, might be leading to that. But it is, it's part of an important, it's contributing something.
Yeah, there's something with the drying or.
Yeah, well, yeah, we looked at that specifically, and it does. Yeah, there's a little bit of it is degraded, but a lot of it is maintained in the drying process, which I was sort of surprised by. Oh, we have questions online too, but I'll take those after.
Yeah, I think you've done a very, very interesting substance. I'm from Indonesia, so we consume a lot of fish. I actually also just know the fish milk. I haven't heard that before, but it's there recently, so I think it's also interesting.
Yeah.
But my question is about your presentation, and I found your systematic review on fish consumption in early life. I think I maybe mentioned that there's a less like strong evidence because of the heterogeneity between studies. So how do you see this recent findings on fish powders on that? And also, how do you also see this potential of using fish powder compared to other interventions such as SKLNS in terms of helping growth in early life?
Great question. And I think there is potential. And in that study, I did find one randomized controlled trial that used 9 grams, I believe it was 9 or maybe 11, given to children starting at 6 to 8 months in Zambia that did improve linear growth. So yeah, there's some evidence, but like I said in the paper, there's so much heterogeneity around it, and like what the fish powder is added to. A lot of times it's added to a food vehicle that's high in phytates. But I think there's a lot of potential as an intervention, as a local food-based intervention, especially where this is a food that's available. A lot of times it can be pounded and it can be added to children's food relatively easily. Yeah, there are some barriers, like a PhD student I'm working with in Malawi found that parents don't want to give it to their babies because they said it elicits like some sort of itchiness. So I think there's still some like work around could this be, you know, this as a behavior change? But I think a lot of people do it. I think probably throughout history, a lot of people have done it. But yeah, I think if it can be promoted as more of a large scale intervention or scaled up, keeping sort of environmental sustainability and overfishing in mind, I think it has a lot of promise.
They have their hand up.
Okay.
Hi, Kendra. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Very, very useful. And I actually have a question about this slide that you have up right now. You know, as you know, one of the most challenging nutrients at this age is iron. And for the first two fish you have here, they're not contributing very much. The one on the right, I'm puzzled by because the powder seems to have a huge amount and the smoked version doesn't. So I'd like to hear what you think about why that is. Is it contamination from the other things that might get into the powder? Or is it because the whole fish is used for the powder and the smoked is not the whole fish? Do you have any thoughts about that difference?
Yeah, and I have thought about that a little bit. And it is surprising that the first two don't have a ton of iron. They might have a little bit, but I think once you powder the fish, once it's in that concentrated powdered form, even a small amount just has a highly concentrated amount of nutrients. I think that's one thing. You know, these other fish have like a small amount of moisture that's diluting the nutrients. The powder really doesn't. It's pounded into like dust, as I've heard some people phrase it. But the fact that it has the powder has such dried iron could be indicative of the iron being added in at later stages of the processing. So the equipment that they use to powder the fish might have had some iron that then, for lack of a better word, leaked into the fish powder concentration. And I've seen that with other sort of processed fish powder. And I've seen people call it contamination, even when they notice more iron in the processed fish than what they would expect from the fresh fish. So yeah, that's a potential. But then it's like, okay, well, what else got in there? You know, that's the food safety aspect that you brought up is so important to look at the heavy metal concentrations. And from what we've seen of relatively large studies or of, you know, there have been like several systematic reviews by a group in the US and at the FAO, has been reassuring as far as like the risk of fish consumption, because it always comes up about the safety, especially people think about mercury, but you know, in low income settings, we think about other things too. But yeah, I think it could be. I have seen a lot of iron in other fish powder samples. So that sort of tracks with what I've seen before.
Okay, well, that sounds like that deserves more exploration if it's coming from something in the machinery. You know, tracking that down and identifying it would be really useful.
Yeah, we dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I also would wonder a little bit about bioavailability. If it is coming from the machinery, you know, what exactly type of iron is that? So worth exploring. But as you know, you've pointed out in the past and others as well, that the iron content, the different types of dried fish varies enormously. And so does some of the other nutrients. So I think it's important, you probably would say this too, that the message go out to be very selective about which species you're thinking about for a fish powder that would be for this target age group, for example. Not all of them will meet much of their needs.
Right. Yeah, and it's a bummer that it's so hard to get the nutrient composition. Like I'm starting a project in Liberia, so we want to look at the smoked powder fish concentration of these things, but there's just no data on it, even though people consume it a lot. So yeah, a lot on that. Yeah.
And one more question having to do with iron, and that is in the opportunity crops slides, you had the iron contribution, for example, from leaves, etc. And you know, we've always known that green leafy vegetables have fairly high amounts of iron, but there's always been some uncertainty. Yeah, this is a good one. There's been uncertainty about how well absorbed that is. And so I was wondering what assumptions were made about bioavailability when you were calculating the percentage of nutrient requirements here.
Yeah, the way that we accounted for lower availability of iron in the diet is to select the estimated average requirement that has I believe we selected the amount that assumed a 5% iron bioavailability. So we used sort of the lower end of that number and looked at how the nutrient composition, as reported in the West African food composition table, would contribute to iron with that low level of bioavailability. But yeah, I also was thinking about when I present food products that have a lot of calcium and a lot of iron, it's like, well, how well are those two competing minerals going to be absorbed? So for example, the amaranth leaves, actually, this serving has more calcium than a cup of milk also. But yeah, what's the absorbability of the calcium given the other minerals and so a lot of complexity there.
Lots more opportunities for research then.
Yeah, just need funding.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for a nice and interesting presentation. I wanted to know about the scalability of these opportunity crops. As you know, if we take amaranth grain, it's really densely nutritious, but considered as a wild food or underutilized in some areas. So, we recommend, or is there any strategy to
So
that up?
the question is, amaranth grain is very nutrient rich, but how do you get more people to grow it? Basically,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, which policymaker do you appeal to, right? Can you appeal to agricultural policymakers and talk about the potential for how it will be climate resilient in the face of some of the other grains? Do you talk to the nutrition policymakers to get the amaranth grain incorporated in their food-based dietary guidelines? Do you talk to the private sector to maybe develop a product made with amaranth grain? So yeah, I'm not sure, but I think I think getting the word out, just how nutrient rich these grains are and these crops are, and how sort of the idea that they've been undervalued and we need a production system that is much more diverse is important, like to lay the groundwork for then these other context specific interventions to be put in place.
The question, well, I have a whole bunch of questions, but the one that was marked by this time. I was thinking about the fish drying and smoking the fish. A lot of these leaves too, as far as I understand, can be consumed fresh, but they're also dry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, like, if you could talk about, I don't know if you cover that in the report or not, but what that means for the nutrient analysis, but then also thinking about like seasonal availability and how that could increase the seasonal availability for some of these.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because the thing I tried to look into for the report is, okay, well, how often can they be harvested? Can you, like, I think the term is like cut and come back or something like that. Like, how often can you do that? And it's hard to find data on that. But then drying them is a whole other sort of aspect of it. And I think there was one leaf that I saw a paper specifically where they like fermented the leaf or something like that. So there's all kinds of, I'm sure there's all kinds of like positive practices out there where there's the indigenous crop or even a non-indigenous leafy crop where they process them lightly to extend the shelf life. And these are just maybe behaviors that need to be identified as like a positive deviance sort of thing and scaled. But yeah, I think, it's interesting. But I don't know, we didn't come across much of that for the report. But yeah, you talk more. Just curious, yeah.
So I think thank you for the presentation. My question is about the discrepancy between iron between the powdered fish and then not powdered, the powdered fish and then the smoked fish. So I just wanted to ask, when you did that analysis, did you buy those samples from the market or you did it yourself? Because from my experience, the one that I sold in the market, the smoked fish are exposed to the sun, so maybe that could also contribute to that effect.
Should contribute to what?
To contribute to the discrepancy in the iron content.
Yeah, potentially, but they were purchased in the market as is, so purchased as powder and purchased as smoked was my understanding. I've emailed James to make sure he purchased the powder specifically in the market, but he hasn't got back to me yet. But basically, they're purchased in the market like as sold. So yeah, so that's an interesting point because yeah, how long have they been in the sun? How long have they been stored? And then yeah, how exactly were they processed? I think we're missing some information on that. Like what was, we got the source of the fish for sure and the scientific names and some metadata around that, but more on like maybe, yeah, like the length of time that fish have been sitting in the sun. Though I don't know if you'd ask a fishmonger, if it, out of the pile of fish, like how long they would know. But yeah, definitely. That's another thing that can impact the nutrient concentration for sure. Yeah. There's a question online. iPad. Go ahead, iPad.
Hi, Kendra and everybody. I just wanted to ask one thing that I might have missed was related to, I was thinking about this being like a climate resilient, crops in terms of the foods, but in terms of aquatic species, when I think about climate change, I think about communities having to change what they're targeting because the fish are reacting to ocean acidification or warming temperatures. So like, was that brought into any of the analyses you talked about, or did you have any comments about that specifically?
Hi, Anne.
Hi.
I think that's Anne's voice. Thanks for that question. Yeah, so none of these studies look specifically at fisher behavior and how they themselves are adapting their behavior. There is a really cool analysis done by Katie Fiorella at Cornell, where she took advantage of data collected by World Fish from Cambodia, so freshwater fisheries systems, and they collected data on fishing activity weekly for like a year or something like that. And so Katie was able to determine that changes in temperature altered fisher activity. So it wasn't even that they were responding to changes in what they perceived as lower catch or environmental emergencies or anything like that. They just were responding very subtly to changes in temperature. So I think that's a really important point. And I think, yeah, looking at the behavior of fishers and fish sellers themselves is going to be important, obviously, in the climate resilience aspect of things. But yeah, good question. But none of these studies looked specifically at that. So that would be very interesting.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Do we have time?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just had just one quick question. If you could pick like one area and you had like a limitless amount of money, which area would you choose to research? The area that question.
Yeah, I mean, I get excited about like the fish powder aspect of things and like how, just because from the research I've seen, it has a lot of potential. So I think a bigger randomized trial, like in a different setting than the Zambia setting, would be interesting to look at the outcomes and also look more at child development. Because though the omega-3 contribution might be small, what is the impact of how the impact on child development of these aquatic foods? So yeah. We will cross our fingers for some funding to study that. And I think we're at time, so I'll just thank you again for joining. It's been super interesting. Thank you for having me. Okay, should everybody into stop the oops. Oh.